Welcome to our webinar where we will be taking a look at some of the elements of fun and functional learning today. Please note that questions asked in the chat feature of the webinar will be answered when I am able to respond. During the presentation, an AbleNet representative will answer chat questions related to any technical difficulties. So all other chat questions will be answered after the webinar by email. Okay, so first, there we go. First, I'd like to share a bit about my background so that you know where I'm coming from when I share stories and experiences. One of the things I've been doing over the last few decades is teaching in a variety of roles. I was very fortunate years ago to start off some of my teaching experience being a teaching assistant or educational assistant, and I recall those experiences very well. I then moved on as a resource teacher and spent several years with a variety of different students in my class. And then moved on to work as a classroom teacher. I worked in an elementary school and particularly taught grade 2 and 3, which I really enjoyed. Later on I became what I like to refer to as a provincial helping teacher and a program coordinator. Now in that role I acted as an outreach consultant and was working with students with severe multiple disabilities and their school teams and families throughout British Columbia in Canada. As a Ministry of Education program coordinator, I was leading a team of therapists to provide on-site consultations to teams in schools. Also worked on website training tools and handouts. We developed individualized curriculum guides and provided distance training, mentoring, and coaching to often learning assistant teachers and resource teachers and their teams. Sometimes we would have team conference calls. One of the things that I've really enjoyed doing the last decade is designing and teaching online practicum-based university courses, emphasizing adult learning principles. And I'm currently teaching with a colleague an online course through Vancouver Island University called Developing Functional Curriculums. Now, I must give credit to Royal Roads University. This is where I did my master's in leadership and training, and they were great in immersing me in really good adult learning principles. And most of the course was online, so I became quite passionate about online learning. So that's a little bit about myself, and it looks like we have a really good group here today. And some of the names here I recognize from a variety of locations. So what I'd like to do next actually is to do a poll here. So if I'll give you maybe a minute or so to just click on the role that would closely describe what you do. And then we'll move to our results and we'll get an idea of what our class makeup is for today's webinar. So far it looks like we have quite a few teachers and special educators. Some therapists, speech and language pathologists. Just give you a little more time. And don't see too many more responses. Oh, a couple more. We'll just wait a few seconds more. And it looks like right now the bulk of our group today are teachers and special educators. couple more people are still logging in. And I'm still getting a couple more people, so I'll just wait a few more seconds. We have a total of 46 responses so far. It looks about 17 people are teachers and special educators. We have about 8 OTPTs, 7 speech and language pathologists, and 5 assistive technologists, and a variety of other individuals as well. Okay, I think our poll perhaps has come to a close now. I am going to close the poll. And about 36% of us are teachers and special educators today. So we'll move along to our next part of our webinar. Okay, so we're going to start today by taking a look at modifications versus adaptations. And some of you might be well versed in this already, but so please excuse me if I'm reviewing something that you're already familiar with, but I always feel this is a good place to start. Now, many individuals on modified programs have IEPs, Individual Educational Plans. So what is a modified activity? Well, these are activities with different learning outcomes, and I've given you some examples here. So for instance, the person might be using voice output device to call out spelling words to class. So their job is, or their learning objective is practicing using their switch on their voice output. They may be counting and sorting colored or white paper for a recycling job. They perhaps might be using their arm to hit a volleyball to a server while standing in the standing frame. And so working on some fine motor and gross motor skills, as well as vision. Another example of a modified activity, perhaps using a communication device to answer simple questions from a motivating YouTube video. And the rest of the class might be working at that time on a novel study or some other language arts activity. So what is an adapted activity? Well, these are activities with the same learning outcomes with adaptations. And again, I'm sure you can think of many with the children that you work with. I've listed just a few here. For instance, spelling the same words as the class, but perhaps using a laptop to print them. Another example, reducing the number of math questions to be completed. And as a classroom teacher, I used to use this technique frequently for a few of my students. Another example here is to provide a longer time to complete an obstacle course in the gym. And my last example here is using text to voice software to answer perhaps questions from a novel. So those are just a few examples. I'm sure you can think of others yourself. Someone has asked if I can talk a little bit louder, so I'm going to do that. Thank you. Okay, let's take a look now at tools for modifications. What kinds of examples can you think of that reflect, oops, just a second, I have the feeling I've skipped ahead here, so I'm going to go back. Bear with me here. This is my first time using the software program. Okay, so let's take a look. What kinds of examples can you think of that might reflect modified learning outcomes? You are welcome to share with the group. In the meantime, I'm going to share a few examples with you. And I'm getting a little bit mixed up here. Okay, so an individual might be using an augmentative communication device to answer simple questions from a story, while classmates work on worksheets answering more complex questions. An individual might be working on improving switch access and speed when using an alternate spinner to participate in math drills with peers. Another example, an individual might be working on a gross motor skill to improve head control while operating a switch to provide spelling words to classmates on a voice output device. That could be a step-by-step communicator or using tap-speak sequence on an iPad. And there's lots of other examples for fine motor, communication, and also vision or hearing. Okay, let's take a look at tools for adaptations. So what kinds of examples can you think of that might reflect adapted learning outcomes? Again, you're welcome to share with the group just if you can think of any other examples. Someone's asking what you would like us to do. So if you would like to share something with the group that's an example of someone doing something with an adapted learning outcome and maybe the tools that they were using, you're welcome to do that. Just send it into the chat. In the meantime, I'll just give you some other examples. For instance, an entire class may be working on a weather identification activity, but one individual may be answering the same types of questions using a voice output device. For instance, using adaptive equipment like computers or voice output. Another example of an adapted learning outcome, an individual might be moving through an obstacle course in gym, but she or he might be given a longer time to do this if there are some mobility issues. So again, our strategy, adaptation strategy here is increasing the length of time to accomplish that task. As a classroom teacher, I would sometimes, as I mentioned, discreetly reduce the number of questions some individuals needed to complete as I knew they needed more time. So I'm sure this is something that a lot of classroom teachers might use to reduce the number of questions or tasks, but you're still looking for the same accuracy level. Computers also are great tools to assist those with fine motor challenges. So anyone have anything that they wanted to share as an example maybe that you've implemented to adapt an activity where the learning outcome is still the same? Just wait a minute and see if anyone has anything to share. Okay, Enid has shared a story with us and around an adaptation, and that is using laptop or word bank to complete the same piece of work for those who are perhaps struggling with writing. Sarah also has an example here using, again, word bank for fill-in-blank quizzes and tests. Great idea. Enid's also shared with us using communication charts to answer topic questions. And Alyssa says that she uses Dragon Naturally Speaking software and eye gaze system software. So those are all really great examples of tools for adaptations. Thanks for sharing those. Okay, let's move on. So why do some individuals disengage from activities? Basically, the activity is really not motivating or meaningful for the individual. That's what I have found in working with lots of students. So this is where we need to really go back and look at motivators for the student. For example, sometimes pencil paperwork or worksheets aren't that motivating for some of our students. Perhaps sorting blocks into containers, tracing lines to move towards printing, maybe matching colors from pieces of paper. I'm sure all of us have seen students working on these kinds of activities. And this is where I think sometimes we end up seeing some behaviors demonstrated by the student to indicate that they're really not interested in that activity. If there is no context or purpose for the activity, then there is no meaning for the individual. We wonder why the individual is acting out, not wanting to go to the activity or even complete the activity. And I think that most of us are aware of some of the reasons that individuals may disengage from those activities. So I've just listed some here for us to review. For instance, some of the causes: if there is no reward. So this activity has no personal motivators in it. And I'm going to talk about personal motivators. We might think the activity is motivating, but it has to be personally motivating to that person. It also may have no meaning. The activity has no real purpose in the student's real world. So we really have to think those are two key features. So the results, well, sometimes the student may try to escape the activity, or we may see that certain avoidance behaviors appear, and sometimes that can be from too much sensory input. Also, some students are seeking attention, and so they may be engaged in other behaviors because of that. They also may be seeking stimulation. For instance, some of the students I've worked with may engage in self-inflicted activities for more sensory input. So sometimes we really need to look at that sensory component. Is there too much sensory input, not enough sensory input? I once worked with an individual who had learned to use projectile vomiting to get out of the activities that were not motivating or meaningful to him. His response was pretty extreme, but he had very few ways to communicate his needs. And in that situation, we really, as a team, needed to look at what was meaningful and fun for him in order to engage him in his learning. Okay, I'm going to move on to our next slide. Let's take a look. What does fun look like? And I think the biggest message I can share is that motivators are specific to each individual, and they spell out fun. So some individuals may be more motivated by social contact and others by sensory. Now I found that if sensory is the main motivator and we want to build on social, then we need to incorporate others into that sensory-based activity. So we should revisit the motivators also every year as they can change as the person matures. And it really is good to check with age-appropriate peers to see what they're interested in each year as well. I find that as part of the IEP meeting, the first IEP meeting in the school year, it's a good idea to update that motivator list. So now we know that fun equals motivation, and vice versa. You may find that most of your individual's main motivators may fall under social or sensory, as we mentioned. If your students' motivators are mostly sensory-based, you may need to attach some of these motivation themes to others on this list to help your individual generalize their interests to new activities and people. We need always to remember that our students' motivators are unique and person-specific. So these are just some key features, I think, for us to keep in mind, and that they're always changing. I wanted to share another story with you. I once worked with a child who had very few motivators according to her family and the people that worked with her at school. She was not interested in music, objects, art, books, or most sensory experiences. And I'm sure you can imagine that her classroom teacher and teaching assistants found it very challenging to have her engage in her learning. This also posed challenges when working on simple communication, for example, choice making, if she had no interest in objects or most activities. We did find that she was extremely motivated by adults, but to the point of distraction. The teacher had to ask parents not to linger outside the classroom in the hallways, as the individual would become obsessed with them and not be able to focus on anything else in the classroom. So we explored increasing her participation through switch activation with a power link. But since she was not interested in anything on the other end of the power link, this had no appeal. Now, voice output did not seem to serve her any use until we came up with the idea to use it to attract her most powerful motivator, adults. So we began to play a hide-and-seek activity where one of the adults would move to the other side of the room, and she had to use a step-by-step communicator to call the person to turn around, recognize her, and then come over to her. She became extremely motivated by this activity as we had tapped into her personal motivator, and she learned to use the step-by-step very quickly in this context. She had just learned an important step to using the communication device. It got her what she wanted. Had we not tapped into her personal motivator, we would likely have abandoned the communication device thinking she was not ready for or interested in using it. So this was a really powerful learning experience actually for us and her team as well. So how do we become good motivator detectives? I've given some examples here. These are some of the general areas that I like to review when I'm talking to both family and often the teaching assistant or educational assistant working with the student. We need to make sure that the individual's family creates a list as well as those who know your individual best at school, as some things may be noticed at home and not school, and vice versa. So let's just take a look here at a few of these examples. First of all, we have, I always like to ask about music because most people do enjoy music of some sort. But we need to become detectives around that music. So what type of music? What rhythms? Can we transfer this rhythm to age-appropriate music? So that's why we need to be a bit of a detective there. It's good to look at sensory. So for instance, in the area of gross motor, and perhaps if the person is in a wheelchair, do they enjoy moving fast? Do they like bumpy surfaces? Do they enjoy vestibular movement? Perhaps swinging kinds of movements? It's really important to do some detective work around that so that we can broaden the number of activities that we can incorporate into that person's day and week that have some of those features. So this is what we're doing when we're being a motivator detective. We're looking for features within motivators that perhaps we're already aware of. Visual, again, and particularly a lot of, if your student has cortical visual impairments or perhaps just some vision issues, what kinds of colors is that person interested in? Is brightness a factor? Perhaps having extra light, perhaps light is a deterrent, or perhaps it helps them to see, be attracted to an object. Also, with regards to visual, does this person have a preference to objects versus pictures? And sometimes we found too, even when we're offering choices, does it help to move the object? So is movement a factor? Additional things to look at with regards to auditory are soft sounds, loud sounds, unusual sound effects, whispers. I've seen a teaching assistant once who found that to really get the attention of the student she was working with, doing little whispers in her ear just really caught that person's attention. And sometimes also I find that, well, let's take a look at social. This ties into social. Are there specific characteristics about the interactions of those people that your student or individual is most drawn to? So I like to be a bit of a detective there. And sometimes we have multiple educational assistants working with students, and we may find that the student just is more responsive to doing their work and working on their activities with one particular individual. So let's look at some of the features of how that person interacts with a student. Perhaps they're more animated. Perhaps it has something to do with their face, facial expressions, or their voice. So it's really important to look at social aspects as well and be a detective about that. Two other areas we can also look at certainly are taste. What kinds of foods, snacks, or drinks are most motivating. I know in many of our classroom situations when working on choice making and often using communication tools, mealtime is a highly motivating activity. So we want to make sure that if we're working on something that is a challenge for that individual, that we have highly motivating snacks or foods as well. The same thing applies to smells as well. So those are some areas that you can certainly take a look at around improving your skills as a motivator detective. And when I'm asking families or a teaching assistant to create a list like this, I give them some examples about digging a little bit deeper. So that's something perhaps you can do as part of the startup of your school year. By being a good detective, we can then build the features of the motivator into more activities for your individual. Okay, so how do we keep your individual's motivators age appropriate? I've worked with many teams and also families who insist that their child's most motivating toy might be an object such as a teddy bear. So I would ask, what is it about this toy that makes it appealing? And how can we translate that into a more appropriate object and activity? For example, perhaps at a high school level or intermediate grades, making stuffed bears to sell at a school fundraiser or for animal welfare. Now, sometimes families and school staff are playing early childhood music that the individual has enjoyed for years, but is now working, let's say, in the intermediate grades. This kind of music is not going to attract age-appropriate peers to come and hang out with the individual. But by being a motivator detective, we can ask what kinds of rhythms, beats, or vocals does the individual prefer. So let's look for those similarities within age-appropriate music and then begin to introduce some of these. In this way, we're helping the student to generalize those interests into more age-appropriate activities. Now, if the individual enjoys big sensory experiences, including noise or funny sounds, let's then try to find age-appropriate ways to experience this with various activities using a power link. For example, using a switch to grind coffee beans for the resource room, or playing loud teen music during breaks or recess time. I really do feel it's up to us as facilitators to make the motivators age appropriate. I thought I would just share a story here. I once worked with a student who had big sensory experiences as a motivator, and the individual's teacher told us that he enjoyed vibration, but it had to be very strong. So we were working on finding a better switch access for this teen, and nothing seemed to be really getting him motivated enough to use that switch. So with permission from his teacher and parent, we brought in a palm sander with a sheepskin attached to it the next day and plugged it into the AbleNet PowerLink. Well, I'll tell you, it was the first time that I saw him laugh so hard. We had tapped into his very unique motivator. Okay, I wanted to have an activity here. I hope you have a piece of paper and a pencil for yourself. And again, you're welcome to share this with us, and I'll just share a few examples. I'd like you to briefly pause for this group activity, and I'd like you to think about an activity that you enjoyed as a young person, and think about how you might engage in this activity now as an adult. So please feel free to share your experience, again, just through the chat here. Keep it short if you can, and I'll share a couple of examples with the group. So I'm just going to give you a minute there to think about something you really enjoyed when you were very young, and how is that manifesting itself now in your life? Might be something you do for leisure. Might be something, if you're really lucky, that you're doing in your work. So please feel free to share something in the chat section. Okay, Zena says that she enjoyed reading as a child, and I'm assuming she still likes to do lots of reading now. Melissa has shared with us that she has always liked music, and now she goes to concerts. Sarah has shared here that she, as a child, used to enjoy coloring, finger painting, and now she likes to draw with pen and ink and paint and watercolors or acrylics. And Kathy has shared she's always enjoyed playing board games when she was younger, and she gets to do that with her class now. That's great. Oh, I really appreciate this from Holly. Holly said that she always enjoyed playing pretend when she was a child, and that she really enjoys getting involved in acting class or a local community play. That's great. That was Barb has indicated that hiking and walking in the woods is something that she used to enjoy, and now she plans annual vacations with a family to the mountains. So those are some great examples. I really appreciate you sharing those. Okay, I'm going to share one more. Diane says that she always liked to climb trees. I can relate to that, Diane, when she was small. And now she likes to rock climb. That's great. Okay, so let's move on to take a look at what do motivators look like for teens. I think we need to remember too that this activity that we just did actually is a really good reminder for staff and family that we can all keep motivators age appropriate. So I've done that sometimes in some of our team meetings. Okay, so we talked about the importance of keeping those motivators age appropriate even though the cognitive level may not change much for the individual. So what might motivators look like for teens? And I've just listed a few here. You know, I think it's really important to sustain a conversation. Are they hanging out in the hallways like others? We need to look at sort of mutual interests and ways for them to attract others. And with regards to that, I wanted to share a story I'm going to call it Cupcake Girl. This was a young lady in a high school where her resource teacher had indicated to me that the staff was frustrated in trying to get her more socially involved with peers in the hallways. Now, she was working on very simple communication skills, such as using her gaze to indicate acceptance or rejection of a preferred activity. And she often took a bit of time to use her switch, either with an iPad, step-by-step communicator, a power link, or the alternate spinner. What was most inhibiting for her was that she demonstrated very little affect or facial expression as part of her condition. So we discussed the idea of attaching a big motivator to her when she was in the hallways. She became the cupcake girl. She would participate using her switches and choice making in making the cupcakes throughout the week, and then move through the hallways using her voice output device to say hi to others and give them a cupcake or muffin. So a few weeks went by, and when I checked back with the teacher later on, this activity was proving to be successful as we were building in a motivator for peers that attached to this individual. Motivators are powerful tools for socialization. Now, the same concepts that we've talked about apply to identifying motivators for adults as well. Many children, as well as adults, enjoy doing something for someone else. And I recall once working with a young woman who enjoyed using her switch with the power link to give massages to her care aide. She enjoyed this more than experiencing the massage herself. So I thought this was quite significant. And here we have a young man using a switch and power link to help make a meal for himself and others. So we've talked about the fun, motivating part of an activity, but what does a functional activity look like? Well, for those individuals working on functional programs, activities such as mealtime and sometimes going to the washroom can have extremely motivating and immediate outcomes that are very functional. Mealtime often is one of the key times when many teams work on basic communication skills because it is so functional and rewarding. If the individual you are working with does not express a need to communicate the desire to go to the washroom, we need to ask ourselves, does this really serve a purpose for the individual if his or her needs are taken care of regardless? So we have to set that situation up. Now, functional activities need to have a real purpose. So the other important component of a great learning activity is making sure that it is functional. In other words, it has meaning to the individual and is not a make-do activity, such as putting blocks into a can, copying lines on paper, matching two-dimensional shapes, or doing hand-over-hand worksheets. I often like to ask, how does time, for instance, become functional for your individual? Does he know his favorite TV program comes on? Does he know when it comes on? Does he know which day he goes to his favorite activity at the local recreation center? Does he know what time he goes to bed and what tasks to do to get himself ready with as little prompting as possible? In other words, does the concept of time have personal function or meaning for the individual? So, what kinds of tools help to support function and participation? Some tools help to support access to the individual's world, including learning and leisure. This could be fine motor or gross motor, and one example certainly is the power link. Other tools help to support communication to others in the individual's world, and there are a variety of voice output devices and software. Now, both aspects increase participation and therefore are vital to all individuals' quality of life. Okay, we're going to again pause for the next activity, and I'd like to ask, what kinds of challenges have you experienced with families or staff when moving from expectations for academics through, say, paper, pencil, desk work to more functional academic learning activities. So if anyone would like to share, perhaps again as briefly, if you can just kind of summarize that briefly as possible, what was the challenge? I would appreciate that, and we'll just share maybe just one or two with the group. I know I was working with one of our teachers in the university. Oops, someone's jotting something down here, but I'll just finish up. University class this past year, and the parent had really, really wanted their child to continue to work on academics, but they had been working on the same activity for, I think, a few years. And so this was something that she was wrestling with. Okay, and Holly too, as basically kind of reiterated this, she's said that with some children, parents have told staff they don't want to give up on the academics, and I've heard that as well. Kayla here is sharing something. She says that the family believes that they aren't meeting curriculum standards when we explain working on more functional academic learning. So this is a common issue for a lot of individuals. And Barb has shared something too about expectations for handwriting versus looking at assistive technology for written communication. That's a very good example too, Barb. So thank you for sharing those. Okay, so what are some strategies that we need to look at to assist families and staff to move to more functional academics? Here are just a few. I'm sure if you have some that you want to share with us, you're welcome to do that as well, but I will just share a few. Sometimes I find that when I'm working with families, I might ask, what do they see the person doing with, let's say numbers is the area that we're looking at. What do they see the person doing with numbers as a teen or adult? And so get them to really visualize that and talk about that. And that sometimes is a bit of a reality check. I might ask, what do they see the person doing with time as an adult? And so, again, making it a real activity, and sometimes that helps us to really pare it down to some simple tasks. And perhaps up to that point, they've been working on worksheets with clocks and things. And again, if they're struggling with this, that helps us to get really concrete and realistic. Again, sometimes I've asked families, how do they see the person using letter recognition? And so, again, students sometimes may spend a few years still working on letter recognition, and they might have some accuracy level there, but the transfer of that into actually words and words that can be used in reading or some other context, it's just not happening. And so, again, we need to look at that. I think asking questions also about how families and also sometimes staff, I know sometimes individuals I'm working with at school are not wanting to let go of the academics. So looking at the future, how do they see the future? So asking questions such as, can the person carry on a conversation? Can the person answer questions about a movie or a social activity? So again, I'm thinking these are kinds of language arts areas, but they're more skill-focused around social engagement that can carry on into hopefully adulthood. And can the person use basic math skills to count, match, sort for a shopping activity? So again, when we look at some of these skills and we think to the future about an activity the person might be participating in, that really helps us to get concrete. I want to share a story. I once worked with a teen who had a very sophisticated multi-level communication device but could not sustain a conversation with someone. She could answer questions with yes, no, or using her communication device, but did not engage in asking someone else a question on the same topic. she was very prompt dependent for conversation. So after working with her team, the resource teacher began doing some role play for a conversation that would occur with the teen's father when she would arrive home at night. This then became a much more enjoyable activity for both the student and her family. Okay. It is my hope that you will look at each and every activity your individual is involved in with new eyes and really question whether those activities are fun and functional for them. We're kind of coming up to the end of our workshop. Oops, we're a little bit early here. Perhaps what I'll do is I can share a little bit more here. I'm not sure if anyone wants to post some questions here, or maybe share some stories with our group of some of the some situations where you have been able to do some motivator detective work or pull in an activity and make a switch over to something more functional. I'm just taking a look at our chat right now, so I'll share a couple of things. Holly has asked about making sure that we are looking at how we appropriate instruction before we do give up on academics. And that's a good point, Holly, too. Yes, I think that we also need to look at the activities that we're doing, how we are instructing, and I think, again, going back and looking at the motivators, are we engaging our students in an activity that is truly motivating to them? It's going to help us look at that quality aspect of our instruction as well. I'm just reading through another comment here. Holly has also indicated that they sometimes have the opposite challenge, that their OT and SLP, speech and language pathologist, insisting on the child using perhaps the same activity as others to communicate. The problem is that the child is nonverbal and communication is difficult, but the activity isn't motivating. So again, yes, we need to go back to definitely build in those motivators and make sure that the activity is motivating. Well, I want to thank everyone so much for your participation in today's webinar. And I also want to give many thanks to AbleNet. If you've got any questions here or anything you'd like to share, we do have a few minutes here. But I wanted to, in the meantime, thank AbleNet for making this possible, to Gloria for her assistance. I must say this is my first time using this particular webinar software, so I apologize for all the little glitches and appreciate you hanging in there with me. I also want to thank everyone who participated today in the webinar. And if you have any comments or questions you'd like to share, please feel free to send me an email. I hope that you will look at your activities, especially at the beginning of the school year, with new eyes that look for new elements of fun and function in everything that we do. Any other comments or? And again, thank you to everyone who's shared their shared stories throughout the webinar. We do have a little bit of time here. Barb has shared something here. She said they have a child who is blind who moves just move this over for a bit so I can see it, who loves movement using a motorized wheelchair. Wow, that's great. That is programmed just to go in a circle, and she can perform and not crash into anyone. Hey, that's a great example, Barb, of thinking outside of the box and tapping into a motivator for that student. Thanks for sharing that. Any other examples that you'd like to share with the group? Otherwise, if individuals need to move on, you can just exit out of the webinar. But I will stay online for a few more minutes. Peggy has also, for those who are still with us, Peggy has also shared that she thinks that the key word here is functional. Sometimes the big push is for academics with some of her students, and they just are not the least bit interested because it's not motivating. So yeah, it's taking a look at that, or sometimes taking a look at the core academics that your students are able to understand, and then again get them into motivating and functional activities. And usually when an activity is functional, there are intrinsic motivators in it. Well, thanks for sharing that, Peggy. Well, I think perhaps we'll sign off, and I'm going to, oops, one more comment here. Holly's asking for some good resources on this topic of purpose, context, things that are meaningful to share with the school's team. And I'm hoping that certainly you could share the webinar. I know that they are archived. And you're welcome to follow up with an email to me. We can chat more after the webinar. So thank you, and I think I'm going to sign off. And thank you for your participation.